Today I got 3 really weird and one-of-a-kind stories for you guys, so stick around till the end because these ones are really terrifying. While you guys listen, I'm going to be gathering some supplies and doing some mining. We started this world in the last episode, so this is basically episode 2. Anyway, thanks for watching and let's get into it. I was living in my car. I wasn't completely without somewhere to go. My sister lived nearby and had offered to let me sleep on her couch, but she had 2 kids in a small apartment, and I didn't really want to add myself to that situation. We got along fine, but I knew how quickly a temporary favor could turn into something neither of us was comfortable with. I was in my 20s and working nights in Knoxville, Tennessee. Depending on how busy we were, I could get out around 1 in the morning, or sometimes closer to 3. It paid better than most of the jobs I could get without a degree, and at that point I cared more about having a steady paycheck than whether I liked the work. My living situation had basically come from a string of bad financial decisions that I don't really need to get into. I wasn't running from anyone or anything like that. I had just gotten myself into a position where keeping my car and paying for food and gas was easier than trying to afford another apartment by myself. The car was a Honda Accord. It wasn't in great shape, but it ran reliably, which was really all I cared about. I'd folded the back seats down and put a cheap memory foam pad across the trunk and back seat area. I had a sleeping bag, 2 pillows, a couple of blankets, a plastic storage bin with clothes in it, and another bag with toiletries. It took some getting used to. The first couple of weeks were pretty miserable because I hadn't figured out a routine yet. I had to think about where I was going to park every night, where I could shower, where I could use a bathroom, and whether somebody was going to knock on my window and tell me I couldn't stay there. Eventually, I got better at it. I found a couple of places where I could shower without anyone asking questions, and during the day I would sometimes spend a few hours at a library or coffee shop just to get out of the car. The hardest part was finding somewhere to sleep where I didn't feel like I was constantly being watched. I didn't like parking in apartment complexes because somebody would eventually notice a car sitting there overnight. Parking lots weren't much better. There were always security guards, employees coming in early, or people walking around who had no reason to be there at 2 in the morning. So I started looking farther outside town. That's how I found the clearing. I don't remember the first time I drove into it, but I know I'd used it few times before the night this happened. It was off a rural road outside the Knoxville area, down a rough dirt entrance that looked like it had been used for logging or some kind of utility work years earlier. It was just a relatively flat clearing surrounded by woods. There were old tire tracks in the dirt, a couple of places where people had apparently had campfires, and some bottles and cans scattered around. I liked it because it seemed like the kind of place people occasionally went when they wanted to get away from everything. The trees surrounded the clearing on every side, and there was a little slope leading down toward a creek somewhere beyond the trees. You couldn't really see the water from where I parked, but you could sometimes hear it if everything else was quiet. In the fall, the place was especially nice. The trees had started changing colors, and because there weren't any streetlights nearby, the sky looked completely different from what I was used to seeing around town. That was the main reason I kept going back. It was quiet. When you're living in a car, quiet becomes something you appreciate more than you would expect. I also didn't feel like anyone cared that I was there. There were enough signs that other people had used the clearing before that I didn't feel like I was trespassing on someone's property, although I never actually checked who owned the land. I'd usually get there after work, eat something I'd picked up somewhere, brush my teeth, and spend some time on my phone before going to sleep. I'd watch YouTube videos with headphones on, or I'd just lie there and listen to the trees and insects. The night I'd worked my usual shift and left after midnight, we'd been busy, and I'd spent most of the night moving pallets around with 2 other guys. Before leaving town, I stopped at a gas station and bought a bottle of water and some crackers. I wasn't hungry enough for a real meal, and I remember thinking I'd just eat the crackers when I got to the clearing. By then I knew the route well enough that I wasn't really paying much attention to the road itself. There weren't many houses along the way, and eventually the streetlights disappeared completely. When I pulled into the clearing, there weren't any other vehicles there. That was one of the things I liked about the place. If someone else was there, I'd usually just find somewhere else to sleep. I didn't want to have to wonder who they were or why they were there. I parked in roughly the same spot I had used before, with the front of the car facing back toward the road. I shut the engine off and sat there for a while. I had my phone connected to a small charger, and I watched some videos while eating the crackers. I remember scrolling through my phone for a while and checking my bank account, because I was waiting for my next paycheck. Eventually, I put the phone down, reclined the driver's seat, and tried to sleep. And I remember opening my eyes to the sound of footsteps somewhere nearby, almost like whoever was walking was trying not to make any noise. That was part of why it took me a few seconds to realize they were actually footsteps. I'd been sleeping lightly because I was in a car and I was used to hearing animals moving around outside. The woods were full of little noises at night. I didn't open my eyes immediately. I just listened. The sound seemed too deliberate to be something small. I remember lying there trying to decide whether I was awake enough to care. Another footstep came from somewhere near the passenger side. I opened my eyes. The inside of the car was almost completely dark. I'd turned everything off before going to sleep, and the only light coming through the windows was the faint amount of moonlight that made it past the trees. I saw someone standing beside the passenger window. I thought it was a man. I couldn't make sense of what he was wearing. He was close enough to the car that I could see his face through the glass, but the darkness made the details difficult to understand. He was wearing some kind of costume. I sat up slightly and looked at him. He was a middle-aged man, somewhere in his 40s or 50s. I can't be more specific than that because I didn't get a good enough look at him to know his exact age. The clothes were strange. They looked like something meant for a child. I don't mean that he was wearing a normal shirt that happened to look childish. The whole outfit gave me that impression. There was something light-colored around his upper body and what looked like shorts or loose clothing around his legs. There seemed to be some kind of collar around his neck, but it was his face that made me stare. He was wearing makeup, a lot of makeup. It looked like someone had tried to paint a child's face onto an adult. His face looked pale. There were darker areas around his eyes, and there was red around his mouth. The makeup didn't look professionally done. It was uneven, like he'd put it on himself without really caring how it looked. It wasn't exactly clown makeup. That's the closest comparison I can think of, but even that isn't quite right. It looked more like some kind of children's costume makeup, and he was just staring at me. There wasn't really any expression on his face at all. The area wasn't isolated. There were roads and houses farther away, and people obviously used the clearing occasionally. It wasn't impossible that some guy had wandered out there for some bizarre reason. I just couldn't figure out why he was standing right beside my car. I sat up more and looked directly at him. He didn't move. I rolled the passenger window down a tiny amount. I probably shouldn't have done that, but I wasn't thinking about the situation as dangerous yet. I was mostly confused. "What are you doing?" I asked. He didn't answer. I waited for him to say something, and asked again. "Can I help you?" He continued looking at me. There was something uncomfortable about the fact that he wasn't reacting to my voice. If somebody had walked up to my car in the middle of the night and I asked what they wanted, I'd expect some kind of response, even if it was something stupid. He didn't even seem surprised that I'd woken up. He just stood there with that blank expression. I rolled the window back up. Then he took a few steps away from the car. He didn't hurry. He walked farther into the clearing and stopped. From where I was sitting, I could still see him clearly enough. He was facing me, just stood there. I thought about starting the car. I should have done it immediately, but there was still a part of me trying to convince myself that this wasn't as strange as it looked. I was also irritated. I'd been living in my car for months, and one of the things I'd gotten used to was feeling like I had nowhere that was really mine. I'd found this clearing because I thought nobody would bother me there. Now there was some strange guy standing outside my car in the middle of the night. I picked up my phone and turned the flashlight on. I pointed it through the passenger window toward him. The light made his face much easier to see. The makeup was even stranger than it had looked in the dark. There was white or very pale makeup around parts of his face, dark coloring around his eyes, and red around his mouth. The edges weren't neat. Some of it looked smeared. He still didn't react to the flashlight, just stood there looking at me. I was considering calling the police when headlights appeared through the trees. A vehicle was coming down the road. The headlights moved across the edge of the clearing, and the man finally turned away from me. He started walking toward the road. I watched him because I wanted to see what he was going to do. The vehicle slowed down as it reached the clearing. The man walked up to it and got inside. I couldn't see who was driving. The car didn't stay there long enough for me to get a good look. The man got in, the vehicle continued down the road, and within a few seconds the headlights were disappearing through the trees. I was left sitting in my car with my phone still in my hand. If I called the police and tried to explain what happened, I wasn't sure what I would even tell them. The more practical part of me also figured that if the guy was gone, there wasn't much the police could do. I didn't go back to sleep. I started the car and drove back toward town. I ended up at a gas station that was open all night and parked under the lights. I went inside and bought a coffee. I sat there for a long time. I felt better sitting somewhere where other people were awake. The part I couldn't get past was his expression. It wasn't that he looked angry. If he'd looked angry, I think I would have understood the situation better. He looked completely neutral, like he was just looking at something. I called my sister once the sun started coming up. She said I shouldn't be sleeping in random places where I had no idea who might be around. She wasn't wrong. She'd been telling me for months that I needed to stop living out of the car, and I knew she was going to use this as another reason. After that night, I stopped using the clearing. I stayed in places where there were other people around. I slept behind a truck stop one night, spent another night in a Walmart parking lot, and once stayed near a friend's apartment after asking if he was okay with me parking there. Eventually, my life moved on. I found a place to stay a few months later and stopped living in the car. The job continued, I got into a better financial situation, and the whole period of my life slowly became something I didn't think about as often. The clearing became one of those memories, you know? I'm June. My life outside of work was pretty chill. I lived with 2 roommates in a small apartment, and most of my weekends were spent with the same group of friends. I was in my early 20s, and I think that age had a lot to do with why I agreed to go along with things I probably wouldn't do now. One of my friends, Theo, was always finding abandoned places. He'd hear about an old house, a closed business, an empty factory, or some property that had been sitting unused for years, and within a few days he'd have a plan to go check it out. He wasn't the type who broke things or stole anything. He just liked exploring places that most people had forgotten about. I'd gone with him a few times. Usually it was pretty harmless. We'd walk around, take pictures, make jokes about whatever old stuff we'd found, and leave. Another friend, Finn, was usually up for it too. Madeline, Theo's girlfriend, came along sometimes. The 4 of us had known each other long enough that nobody really needed an invitation anymore. Somebody would mention doing something on a Friday or Saturday night, and the rest of us would usually figure it out from there. It was an abandoned building somewhere in Pennsylvania, well away from the main road. I couldn't point to the property on a map. There were a lot of wooded stretches around there, with old farm properties and patches of forest separated by roads that weren't particularly busy. According to Theo, the building had once been used for some kind of packing or processing operation. He wasn't sure what they had packed there. I remember him saying it might have had something to do with food or agriculture, but he'd heard different versions of the story. The part that interested us was that the building had apparently been abandoned for years and still had some of the old machinery inside. The plan was to go there, drink a little, look around, and hang out for a few hours. Nobody was expecting anything unusual. Madeline had a couple of sleeping bags in the trunk of her car. Theo thought it would be funny to bring them with us, so we ended up taking them into the building. It turned into less of an exploration and more of a stupid camping trip inside an abandoned factory. We got there after dark. Finn was making fun of Theo because he'd gotten the directions wrong once already. We had to turn around and take another road before we found the access road that led toward the property. There wasn't much around the building. The trees were close on almost every side, and the road leading toward it wasn't much more than gravel and dirt. There were no houses right next to the property that I remember seeing. Once we left the main road, it felt like we were farther away from everything than we actually were. It felt like we'd found somewhere nobody cared about anymore. We parked on the other side of the property from the building because there was a spot where the trees gave us some cover, and partly because we didn't want the cars sitting right in front of the place. It seemed like a practical decision. Getting inside wasn't difficult. There was an opening on one side of the building where part of a door or wall had already been damaged. We weren't breaking through anything. Somebody had obviously been inside before us. The interior was much larger than I'd expected. There were old machines spread throughout the main room, most of them covered in rust and dust. Some looked like parts of conveyor systems, while others were things I couldn't identify at all. There were metal frames, pipes, old electrical boxes, and other equipment that probably made perfect sense to somebody who had worked there decades earlier. To us, it just looked like a bunch of giant pieces of junk. There was dirt and dead leaves across parts of the floor, and the building had that old, damp smell you'd expect. We found an area along one wall where the floor was relatively clear and dry. That's where we put the sleeping bags. Nobody was actually planning on sleeping. It was just somewhere to sit. Theo had brought beer, and Finn had something else to drink. I don't remember what I had, but I remember that none of us were drinking enough to be falling over or anything like that. We were just sitting around, talking, and occasionally getting up to look at some piece of machinery. Finn spent about 10 minutes pretending he knew what every machine had been used for. He'd point at something and make up a completely ridiculous explanation, and Theo would either agree with him or come up with something even worse. At one point, Finn stood next to an old conveyor belt and told us this must have been where they packaged Amazon orders. It was stupid, but it had us laughing. I remember being pretty comfortable there. We weren't sitting around expecting some guy to come walking out of the woods. We were comfortable enough that I had taken my shoes off and was lying in the sleeping bag while the others talked. We'd been there for like an hour and a half when Madeline got up. She said she needed to go outside for a minute. There wasn't a bathroom, obviously, and she didn't want to walk too far from the building. A couple of minutes later, she came back through the opening we'd entered from. She didn't say anything immediately. She just stood there, looking toward the outside. Theo asked what was wrong. She said, "There's somebody out there." I remember sitting up because I assumed she'd seen one of us. Finn asked, "Who?" She said she didn't know. Then she told us there was a person with a flashlight. That changed the mood pretty quickly. Theo turned the music off. Someone switched off the flashlight we'd been using inside. I couldn't see the person at first. From where we were sitting, there were trees blocking the view outside. I saw a small light moving between the trees. It was definitely a flashlight. The beam would disappear behind the trees and then show up again somewhere else. It wasn't moving quickly. My first thought was that it was probably another group of people exploring the place. That didn't seem especially strange. If Theo had found out about the building, there was no reason somebody else couldn't have heard about it too. Finn said something same. Theo didn't seem convinced. He told us to stay quiet for a minute. We moved farther inside, toward a section where some of the old machinery blocked us from view, but still gave us a narrow look outside. I remember crouching down beside Madeline. Nobody was panicking. It was more awkward than anything at first. We were all trying to figure out who the person was without being seen ourselves. The flashlight gradually got closer. Eventually, the person stepped out from between the trees far enough that we could see him. It was a man. He had dark clothes on and a backpack over his shoulders. He stopped near the edge of the trees and looked around. We watched him for a few seconds. Then he walked into an open area not far from the building and took the backpack off. I thought he was looking for something he'd dropped. He crouched down. I realized he was digging. He had some kind of small tool in his hand. I couldn't identify it from where I was, but it looked like a little shovel or something similar. He dug into the ground for a while, continued digging. Then he started putting dirt into the backpack. That was the part that really confused me. If he'd been digging a hole, I could have understood that. Maybe he was looking for something. Maybe he'd buried something there. But he wasn't just digging and then covering the hole back up. He was taking the dirt. He'd scoop some up, put it in the backpack, move some more dirt, and do the same thing again. Finn whispered that the guy was collecting soil for something. It sounded weird. We stayed there watching him. The whole thing felt so ordinary in the way he was doing it that it was difficult to decide whether we were witnessing something suspicious or just something we didn't understand. He wasn't looking around nervously. He didn't seem to think he was doing anything wrong. Eventually, he stopped digging and closed the backpack. Then, instead of leaving, he sat down. He sat there in the open area with the backpack beside him. We watched him for a few minutes. I remember getting uncomfortable because I was still crouched behind the machinery and my legs were starting to hurt. Nobody wanted to stand up. Nobody wanted to make enough noise to let him know we were inside the building. Theo quietly said we should probably leave. The problem was that our cars were on the other side of the property. We'd parked them away from the building, partly behind the trees. To get there, we'd have to leave through another opening and cross an area where there wasn't much cover. If the man was paying attention, there was a good chance he'd see us, so we waited. Eventually, he stood up. He picked up his backpack and started walking toward the building. That was when I became worried about being there. Until that point, I could tell myself that we were watching some stranger doing something weird in the woods. Once he started walking toward us, it felt like the situation had changed. From where I was crouched, I could see him more. He looked toward the building. He looked around the property. Then he reached into one of his pockets and pulled something out. I couldn't see what it was. It looked like a small object, possibly something wrapped in cloth or paper. He held it for a moment while looking at it, then put it back into his pocket. He didn't come inside. He stood there for another minute or so, looking around. I remember thinking that maybe he'd noticed our cars. If he had, he gave no indication. He turned around and walked back toward the trees. We watched until he was far enough away that we could no longer make out his shape. Theo whispered that we were leaving. We packed everything as quietly as we could. Madeline rolled up her sleeping bag and carried it under one arm. We waited a little longer. There was no sign of the man. Then we moved. We went out through the opposite side of the building and crossed the property toward the cars. I remember trying not to make noise even though we were walking across dirt and leaves. The trees blocked our view of the area where the man had disappeared. We pulled away from the property. It wasn't until we were back on the main road that anyone really started talking. Finn was the first one. That guy was burying something. Theo said. He was taking dirt. Yeah, but why? We went over every possibility we could think of. Maybe he'd buried something there earlier, or looking for something, or collecting soil for some reason, or he'd been checking a spot where somebody had buried something. The strangest part was that the man had seemed completely comfortable. He walked through the woods in the middle of the night with a flashlight and a backpack like he'd done it before. We got home without anything else happening. After a few days, I stopped thinking about it. Then Madeline called me. We were talking about something unrelated when she brought up the abandoned building. She asked me if I'd noticed the smell. I asked what smell. She said the smell outside. I didn't know what she meant. She said that after we'd left the building, while we were crossing the property toward the cars, she'd noticed a really strong smell around the area where the man had been sitting. She said it smelled like rotten meat. Once she said that, I remembered it. I hadn't thought about it since that night. There had been a smell. It was difficult to describe because it wasn't just the normal smell of an abandoned building. It was something much worse, like the smell you get when an animal has been dead somewhere for a while. There were woods everywhere. There could have been a dead deer nearby, or something else we'd never seen. But when Madeline brought it up, I remembered that the smell seemed strongest around the area where the man had been digging. We asked Finn about it. He remembered it. Theo didn't. He said he was too focused on getting back to the car. That was where this ended. We had no idea who he was, what he'd been doing, or whether he'd actually done anything illegal. All we had seen was a guy digging in the ground and putting dirt into a backpack. If I think about it logically, that's not even the strangest part. People go into the woods at night. People explore abandoned properties. People collect things for reasons that might make no sense to somebody watching them from a distance. What I can't explain is the combination of everything we saw. He came out of the trees with a flashlight and a backpack. He walked directly to a particular area. He dug into the ground. He put the dirt into the backpack instead of simply moving it aside. Then he sat there for several minutes. After that, he walked toward the building, looked around, took something out of his pocket, and left. And afterward, there was that smell. I used to travel a lot for work in my late 20s because the company I worked for handled stuff for different places, and somebody had to go out there and look at things in person. A normal day usually meant getting in my car early, driving somewhere I hadn't been before, spending a few hours going through equipment or paperwork, taking pictures, talking to whoever was responsible for the property, and then driving back home. I was usually by myself, so I could listen to whatever I wanted and not have to talk to anybody for a few hours. The downside was that some of the jobs were far enough away that I couldn't reasonably drive home afterward. Whenever that happened, my supervisor would tell me to get a hotel and put it on the company card or submit the receipt. I wasn't picky about hotels back then. As long as the room was clean, the shower worked, and I had somewhere to sleep, I didn't really care what the place looked like. I remember the general area. It was one of those parts where you can drive for a long time and feel like you're nowhere near a real city. I'd originally planned on driving home that evening. It would have been a few hours though, and I'd already been on the road most of the day. By around 6:30, I was tired enough that I didn't really want to spend another 3 or 4 hours behind the wheel. I called my supervisor and told him I was probably going to stay somewhere nearby. He said that was fine and told me to just submit the receipt. I sat in my car for a few minutes looking for hotels on my phone. The first place I called didn't have any rooms. The second one had a room, but the price was ridiculous for what looked like a pretty ordinary hotel. I remember staring at the price for a while and thinking that technically the company was paying for it, but I still didn't want to be the person who submitted that receipt. Eventually, I found a little place a few miles outside town. It had rooms available and wasn't particularly expensive. It looked like an older country hotel, and I figured I'd be there for one night, so I booked it. When I arrived, the place wasn't really a hotel in the way I usually think of one. It looked more like somebody had taken an old house and converted it into a guest house. There was a larger main building, a gravel parking lot, and another smaller building behind it. There were only 2 other cars in the parking lot when I pulled in. It immediately gave me the impression that the place was almost empty. I went inside with my overnight bag and found a woman working behind the front desk. She looked like she was in her 50s. She was friendly enough, but she seemed distracted, like she'd been doing 3 things at once before I walked in. She gave me the key and explained where my room was. While she was talking, she mentioned that the building was old and that some parts of the floor were uneven. She laughed about it. She said something along the lines of, "Just watch yourself in the hallway. This place has been here longer than I have." I assumed she was exaggerating. The building did have that old house feeling once I got farther inside. It looked less like a professionally decorated hotel and more like somebody had furnished the place with whatever they already had. There was no elevator. My room was upstairs, so I carried my bag up and found the door. The room itself was fine. It was clean, which was really all I cared about. There was an old wooden dresser against one wall, a small television, a bed, a nightstand, and a bathroom attached to the room. After spending most of the day around other people, I didn't mind being somewhere that seemed almost completely empty. I put my bag down, took my shoes off, and sat on the bed for a few minutes. I was hungry, so I looked up restaurants nearby and ordered something from a place in town. While I waited for the food, I called my mom. My mom always wanted to know where I was whenever I traveled for work. She wasn't worried about me traveling, but she'd ask questions anyway. Where are you staying? How far is it from the job? When are you coming home? Is the hotel okay? I'd usually answer everything in the shortest possible way because I knew she'd keep asking if I didn't. My food arrived sometime after that. I ate sitting on the edge of the bed while watching TV. Nothing about me was strange that night. I wasn't exhausted to the point where I was falling asleep standing up. I'd eaten, talked to my mother, watched television, and was getting ready for work the next morning. Eventually I showered and changed into pajamas. I checked the time because I wanted to get to sleep. It was around 11 when I decided to use the bathroom one last time before going to bed. The bathroom was small enough that there wasn't much room to move around. There was a toilet, a sink, a shower, and an old wooden door that opened directly into the bedroom. I went inside and closed the door behind me. I don't think I even locked it. It makes what happened harder to understand. I wasn't worried about anybody coming in. I was alone in my room, and the bathroom was attached to it. I used the bathroom, washed my hands, and reached for the door handle. It wouldn't turn. Old buildings have old hardware, and I'd already noticed that the place wasn't exactly new. I tried turning the handle harder. It still wouldn't move. I checked the little lock on the inside of the door. It wasn't engaged. I tried pulling the door toward me, then pushing it slightly before trying the handle again. I figured the door had shifted in the frame. Nothing worked. I gave the handle another try. It wouldn't move. Then I saw the gap underneath the door. Because the floor was uneven, there was a space of maybe an inch or two underneath it. Normally I wouldn't have paid any attention to it. There was a shadow across it. Someone was standing on the other side. I didn't immediately understand what I was looking at. Somebody from the hotel had accidentally come into my room. That didn't make sense. I'd checked into the room properly, but it was the only thing I could think of. I wondered if I'd somehow been given the wrong room. I said, "Hello?" Nothing. The shadow stayed there. I tried the handle again. "Can you open the door?" Nothing. I could see part of the person's feet through the gap. I couldn't see enough to tell what they were wearing, and I couldn't see their face, obviously. But there was no question that somebody was standing directly outside the bathroom. There was still a part of me that thought this had to be some kind of stupid misunderstanding. Maybe another guest had gotten confused and walked into my room. I said seriously, "Open the door." The handle moved slightly. I had my hand wrapped around it, and for a moment it felt like somebody on the other side had moved the door in the opposite direction. I pulled harder. The door didn't open. At that point, I realized whoever was outside wasn't simply standing there by accident. They were holding the door shut. I pushed my shoulder against it. "Open the door." No answer. I could still see the shadow underneath. I pushed again. The door didn't give. I kicked the bottom of it. The noise was much louder than I expected in that small bathroom. It echoed around the room, and I thought that would be enough to make whoever was outside leave. I kicked it again. "Open the damn door." The shadow moved. It shifted away from the bottom of the door for a second, almost as if the person had stepped back, and then came closer again. I was standing there thinking that this couldn't actually be happening. I had gone into a bathroom in a hotel room. Now somebody was standing outside it and physically preventing me from leaving. I yelled again. This time the person said something. I couldn't understand a word. It sounded like a man's voice, but the words were too muffled or unclear for me to make them out. It wasn't a normal response like, "What?" or "Hold on." It sounded like he was mumbling something. I shouted, "What?" He said something again. I still couldn't understand it. I wish I could say I remember the exact sound of his voice, but I don't. I just remember that I knew there was a man on the other side of that door because of the voice and the shadow. I kicked the door again. Then the shadow moved away. For a moment there was nothing underneath the door. The handle suddenly turned. The door opened. Nobody was there. I stepped out into the bedroom and looked around. My TV was still on. My bag was still sitting on the floor where I'd left it. The bed hadn't moved. There was no one hiding in the room. I looked toward the door leading into the hallway. It was closed. I opened it and looked outside. The hallway was empty. I honestly didn't know what I was supposed to do next. I checked the hallway in both directions. Nothing. I went downstairs in my pajamas and found the woman at the front desk. She looked surprised to see me. I was standing there in sleep clothes, but I didn't care. I told her someone had been holding my bathroom door shut. She didn't understand what I meant at first. I explained it again. There was somebody outside my bathroom. They wouldn't let me open the door. She asked me if I was sure I'd locked my room. I told her I hadn't locked the bathroom, and I hadn't locked the room because I'd been inside using the bathroom. She called another employee who was somewhere in the building. The two of them came upstairs with me. We checked my room. They looked around the property as much as they could. The hotel staff were confused. They didn't seem like they were trying to hide anything. If anything, the woman at the desk seemed genuinely upset that something like this had happened to a guest. Nobody had an explanation. I was ready to drive home, even though it was after midnight. The woman at the desk kept apologizing as I collected my things. She said they'd never had anything like that happen before. I believed her. I didn't get the feeling she knew anything about the person. I took my things back upstairs and decided I would stay in the room until morning, rather than drive few hours while I was exhausted. I locked the room door this time. I checked it twice. I pushed the bathroom door open and left it that way. Eventually, I got back into bed. I kept the TV on because I didn't want the room quiet. The next thing I remember was waking up because I felt something touching my feet. I thought I was dreaming. My feet were sticking out from underneath the blanket, and there was a strange pressure against one of them. I opened my eyes. The room was dark. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Someone was standing beside the bed. They were bent over near my feet. Their hands were actually touching them. I couldn't see the person's face. The room was too dark, and they were positioned near the foot of the bed with their back partly toward me. I screamed. The person jerked upright and ran. The door to the hallway was open. I watched the dark shape disappear through it. I scrambled backward on the bed and grabbed the blanket around myself. For a few seconds I couldn't even move. I got up and ran toward the door. The hallway was empty. There was nobody running down it. I couldn't hear footsteps. I went back into the room and looked at the door. There was no damage to it. The lock wasn't damaged. I couldn't understand how somebody had gotten into the room. I was certain I'd locked the door. I told the woman what had happened. This time, the hotel staff called the police. When they arrived, I explained everything that had happened, including the earlier incident with the bathroom door. They couldn't find anyone. There was no sign that somebody had forced their way into the room. There weren't any damaged locks or broken windows. I told them that I'd actually seen someone touching my feet and watched them run out through the hotel room door. They asked me if I could describe the person. It was too dark. I couldn't even tell them what the person's face looked like. They searched the property as much as they could, but nobody was found. By the time everything was finished, I didn't care anymore about getting any sleep. I packed my things and left. I still can't explain how they got inside. The first time, somebody had apparently been standing outside my bathroom and holding the door shut. The second time, somebody was inside the room with me, and the hotel room door hadn't been damaged.